All right. So, Joe, welcome to the Big Ideas in App Architecture podcast. How are you doing this Friday?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So you just told me that you kind of live close to an island and you have this internet communication issue. The last episode I recorded was with this gentleman who is a chief architect at this company called Ericsson, and we were talking about how, in his opinion, the inventions around 5G and the way communication towers work is one of the greatest invention in society, more than AI. So I was just kind of reminded of that based on your comment. But for everyone listening in, Joe Duffy here from Pulumi, he's the CEO. Has previously worked at Microsoft, and went on to start this company Pulumi. And when I was researching, is this correct that Pulumi means broom in Hawaiian, Joe?
That is correct, which seems like a funny word to choose for a cloud tooling company, but it's named after a good friend of mine. He was a mentor for many years. His last name is Broom. He grew up in Hawaii, so Hawaiian for broom is Pulumi. And unfortunately, he sort of kicked me in the butt to start the company, and then promptly, unfortunately, got cancer and passed away. So it's sort of a tribute name to him.
Amazing. I mean, I was researching, and it's good to know the story. I mean, this great name. So I don't want to butcher your intro. I feel like you should tell it the best it can be. Tell the people a little bit about yourself, what Pulumi does, and what gets you excited to do what Pulumi does.
Yeah, happy to. And again, really happy to be here. And by the way, it's easy to take communications infrastructure for granted until you move to living on an island where you didn't even think to check in advance. Hey, do we get 5G out here? I know from experience. But yeah, so, I started programming at an early age, sort of just fell in love with writing code. My first programming language was actually C, which I don't recommend, but taught me a lot about programming. Got my career started pretty early, started a consulting business in high school to help companies get to the internet. And then ended up at Microsoft for many, many years working on developer platforms. I was an early engineer on .NET and helped with some of the C# programming language. Actually, before I left, was running all of the languages groups and compilers and a lot of Visual Studio stuff. Helped actually get .NET to be open source and cross-platform on Linux and Mac, which was an awesome project to work on. And yeah, just kind of what got me up out of bed every day was making developers as productive as possible, writing code and building great software. And got excited about this new cloud thing that came along somewhere in there, and realized that really we're entering the era of distributed computing, which we've been talking about since, the 50s and 60s. And, I worked on multi-core a lot in the 2000s. And that's a really exciting shift for how we build software. And yet, when I talk to my customers, the developers in the world, they weren't as excited about the cloud. It was more of an afterthought. And then I went and talked to infrastructure teams, and they were using tools that were not nearly, as feature rich and capable as what developers had with great programming languages and IDEs. And so Pulumi was sort of a opportunity to take a step back, to bring the cloud closer to developers and give infrastructure teams amazing developer experiences and hopefully help them work better together. So that's kind of where we started.
That's awesome, And, when I was thinking about Pulumi, I mean, obviously we at Cockroach Labs also, our developers use Pulumi because you have Go support. What I loved when I was researching you and the company was like your mission is so amazing. Like it's got very clear, focus that to democratize the cloud for every engineer, right? And I remember when I was using Terraform, and I was just using my personal experience, right? I wouldn't have to go and figure out how the Terraform YAML works and everything and structure everything based on that. But I think one of the biggest differentiators, at least from the beginning you have had, is that you have any developer who is familiar with whatever programming language can use your methods to call the cloud and build infrastructure, and kind of you're democratizing it for everyone. So how did was that the core idea initially to start when you were starting the company?
It actually wasn't. We went down a bunch of different paths, but all roads led back to infrastructure as code. And the reason why is, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. The founding team at Pulumi we've created multiple programming languages in the past. Our first engineer actually was one of the co-creators of TypeScript. So we actually started writing a cloud programming language. And after a few weeks, we're designing the floating point syntax, and we realized, new syntax, that's not really the problem people have. What the problem is, the cloud has resource lifetime that's different from, let's say, your operating system. In an operating system, you say, hey, spin up a process, spin up a thread. Well, the equivalent in the cloud is a Kubernetes cluster and a service in the cluster and an RDS database in AWS or Cockroach database. The atoms that you're programming are very different in the cloud than typical programming scenarios. And infrastructure as code solves that. And honestly, Terraform, amazing technology, a lot of great ideas in there. The whole idea of declarative infrastructure as code and this idea of a goal state and convergence. But we wanted to marry that with general purpose languages where, hey, if you know Python, if you know Go, the cloud's going to be at your fingertips. And that was sort of the aha moment that led us to infrastructure as code.
Nice. That's awesome. So for everyone listening in, and I'm pretty sure my numbers are off or just because I was researching, you guys have a very well-structured company now. You count about 50 Fortune 50 companies as part of your customers, almost 2,000 customers, 150,000 users in the market. That's what I found. Is that how you guys are doing? Or have you grown from those numbers that I just found?
Yeah, we've grown, especially in the last year, we've grown very rapidly. So those numbers sound like probably circa 1 year ago. So we now have over 300,000 folks in the community and over 3,200 customers. And so each of those is a company, not an end user. So 3,200 companies that are actively using Pulumi. And that doesn't even account for open source. That's just the commercial side.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm glad to know that you have 300,000 users now using the platform. Now, I liked what you were saying, like this idea that you've had like different, I would say versions of the company as kind of the company's mission has evolved, but infrastructure as a code was at the center of it, and making this work for the developers was like one of the key problems that you were trying to solve. So tell us a little bit about how, when that mission was evolving, what were some of the biggest surprises that came along the way? Was it like this moment where you were talking to somebody and someone said, tell me a little bit about that?
It's a very good question because honestly, I think it was 2019 was basically like a year after we launched the open source, 2 years after we started the company, because we were in stealth building the open source project for about a year. It was kind of difficult technology to build, multi-language runtime. In 2019, I decided to go, it was over the holidays, I think in 2018, I was like, hey, next year I'm going to go to like 30 conferences and I'm going to staff the booth and I'm just going to talk to people. And it seemed like a good idea at the time until I actually had to book all the travel, but it was totally worthwhile because what I realized is we were trying to build for developers, and it's great, love that developers can spin up infrastructure, but I went to DevOps days, and I think I went to like 13 of them around the world and talked to people on the infrastructure side and realized, wow, there's a lot more pain here than I realized. Like everybody's kind of like, yeah, we're using this HCL language stuff, the domain specific language. You don't love it. We're copy and pasting it everywhere. And we actually know Python. That's the other aha moment was like, folks in the DevOps space, they've got Bodo. They come from a heritage of, Chef and Puppet, and there is the programming language expertise there. And so we were able to sort of pivot pretty hard towards that opportunity to the point where now most of our usage is driven from the infrastructure platform team. And they're building a bridge to the developers, and developers love Pulumi too. But it usually starts with the infrastructure team. And that was kind of a surprise along the way.
Right. And was the product from the very beginning like open source and you had like an enterprise version? Is that how you always structured the solutions?
Yes. Open source was essential to us from day one. It wasn't even a conversation. It was a requirement from day one. I started my career in open source. I was a big Linux guy. That was how I got started. And then back to my roots when I open sourced .NET at Microsoft. And, something like an infrastructure as code tool that you're going to write code to, like it has to be open source, in my opinion. But the commercial model, like we wanted to build for the long term and have a sustainable business. And so the way I think about it is like our open source is like Git and our commercial product is like GitHub, right? You can use Git without GitHub if you want, but security, reliability, collaboration, you get great things like pull requests, It's valuable. People want to use it with Pulumi Cloud, but you don't have to.
Got it. Yeah, that's awesome. That's good to know. I mean, I think that's like the right structure to have today. I feel like open source is very important, like just for people who are really small projects, but at the same time, we cannot like just use open source now in an enterprise fashion. We have to protect the assets and the users that at the end of the day, we are serving. One of the things I was like really interested in when I was like researching was, obviously I have personal experience with Terraform. I've enjoyed using it for some of my stuff, and I don't use a lot of it because I have to do like a lot of POCs. So I need something that tears down, quickly and things like that. When I was researching Pulumi, and I know our development team uses it, what makes the way Pulumi works different from Terraform and CloudFormation? Obviously, you can program in your own language and things like that, but what are the constructs that you have added there that make it amazing and more friendly for developers and for companies that want to scale?
Yeah, I think, the language is one part. It's very surface level, but it's like the second order effects that tend to matter a lot, which is now you've got a language. While you get statement completion in your IDE, you can right click, go to definition. You can right click and refactor it much more easily. You get copilots that understand general purpose languages. So if you're using GitHub Copilot in VS Code, it's just going to work great. You get test frameworks. You get linters, so you can enforce coding standards. And all the things we know about programming languages now apply to your infrastructure as code. And, some of those do apply for HCL, but it's basically like starting from the ground up, whereas, there's 100x at least, programmers in the world that know Python compared to HCL. So just larger communities and that sort of thing. I think that's the biggest, but, sharing and reuse, the fact that you get classes and libraries and functions, and it just helps with complexity at scale. And let me tell you, like, the infrastructures we see, especially these days, compared to 7 years ago when we started, people have thousands of resources they have to manage because the cloud architectures have gotten so much more complicated. And just being able to whip out a for loop and say, for every availability zone in AWS, spin up an EC2 instance and, or a subnet, like, it's easy to take that for granted. Those can be killer features, though.
No, I agree. I've made that mistake. I mean, you know which platform I must have used. so, uh, so it's what I like. What I wanted to get to was like, obviously, you are allowing this programming specific, you know, ability for users. That's where everybody's familiar with it, and some people are not. When it comes to like tools like Terraform or CloudFormation, there is this idea that we have to manage all these resources. So at the end of the day, cloud is there. All these cloud providers are changing and adding all these different resources. They're making changes, all those modifications. So it comes down on me to kind of stay up to date with like modifying things and keeping up to date. How are you managing that for the developers? Like, does the code kind of keep refreshing with whatever modifications the AWS or like Google or Azure are doing? Or is it something that comes down to the developer to kind of look for?
Yeah, so for us, the first layer of the answer is that we want to make sure every new feature that the cloud providers ship is available in Pulumi, just full, we don't want to get in your way. So we've actually increasingly moved to a model of code generating our SDKs off of things like the Azure Open API spec, which they publish. Same thing with Kubernetes. Avis has a similar thing, the Cloud Control API. What that means is if you're at reInvent and you hear an exciting new feature just got launched on day one, chances are it's already available in Pulumi by the time the keynote kind of goes live. And then we do work with the cloud providers to make sure we have materials on how best to use those new capabilities. We do have Copilot, Pulumi Copilot, not GitHub Copilot, that kind of like helps you refactor code and update it to use the new services. So you can literally just, in fact, we're about to ship by the time this podcast goes live, it'll probably be out there, which is a extension to VS Code that allows you to embed Pulumi Copilot straight in VS Code. So you can just highlight 10 lines of infrastructure as code and say, update this to use the latest and greatest, and it will just refactor your code. So that's another part of the answer.
That's awesome. Yeah. And that reminds me, when we connected last time, you were going to like modify some existing code to another language did that work with Claude?
Oh, it helped. We're not done with the project, but it definitely helped.
Okay.
We're actually Cursor was a big help. Funny enough, my first attempt was with VS Code, and I asked it to refactor, and it said, "I'm sorry, but refactoring an entire code base from .NET to Java is a major undertaking. I recommend you think harder about it first." I'm like, "What? I asked you to migrate it," but Cursor was happy to help.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's what I think our conversation was around Cursor, and I've really, really enjoyed using it. In fact, since the last time we spoke, I've completed an entire module within like a couple of days easily because of how good it was. But we'll come back to AI in just a bit. Let's stay on the topic of like the cloud landscape. So you've been in the cloud space for a while. You've worked at Microsoft and just specifically Azure, and you understand that landscape. It has evolved so much in the last like 10, 15 years. We used to play around with VMs, and then the cloud came, and within the cloud we had this whole journey of containers and orchestrations and Kubernetes. So it's been a lot of evolution. What are the trends that you are seeing, especially in this context for infrastructure as a code, and how Pulumi is going to make it easy? Because it seems like the adoption is finally there. Like everybody is like, okay, this is no longer an old reality for us. We have to be on the cloud. And that means we have to manage all of this infrastructure. So what do you foresee, and how are you thinking leading the company?
Yeah, it's a good question. I reInvent this last year. We actually rented a suite, and we had customers up there. And over the course of 2 days, I probably met with 30 different customers, and it was almost like deja vu. Talking to customers, they were like, "Well, let me tell you what we're doing. We are codifying our infrastructure best practices within the infrastructure platform team, making sure that security and compliance are built in from the outset, so that the security team is happy, and we're turning around and trying to empower developers to be self-serve so that they can spin up their own infrastructure without having to file tickets and so on." That story, almost every customer, I would say like 90%. And I think that's sort of like, that was the nirvana everybody was trying to get to and thinking about, especially when adopting Kubernetes over the last 5 years. And I would say people are finally getting there. Infrastructure as code is a key part of that solution. But the thing for me is there's a lot of choose your own adventure, right? So there are interesting decision points in that process. Like, for example, okay, you're going to enable self-service for developers. Well, do developers interface with IaC directly? Do they interface with Kubernetes YAML directly? Do you want to give them a simple YAML manifest where they don't care if it's Kubernetes or IaC? They just like check in some YAML to CI/CD and magic happens, and out pops a microservice environment for them. Do you want a point and click UI? And I would say those are the most common answers. A lot of people end up on different points along the spectrum. So that's an area for us where we're trying to help those end-to-end scenarios be a little more out of the box and buttery smooth.
Right. I mean, that's awesome. I feel like I'm noticing that more and more people are realizing that, this is now table stake. You have to build infrastructure and you have to make it scalable. And I think one of the reasons why I have enjoyed using infrastructure as a code is that it allows me to kind of replicate, reuse, rinse and repeat a certain methodology. My developers can go back and look what we did, how we did. It's a shareable. It's like projects is pretty standard. It's very easy for us to maintain and manage, which is awesome. But that also is the reality of our times, and that's where we are going. However, the other thing that we are going towards is this whole push from AI. And I know you, Pulumi Copilot, I was researching, and you kind of brought it up, is it is introduced on your infrastructure as a cloud, right? So can you tell us a little bit about how it's helping users on a day-to-day basis? Where do you think this evolution is going to take them? How much more you're investing towards it, and your own personal excitement?
For sure. And honestly, we got started over 2 years ago on this. And our first incarnation of AI was helping people write their infrastructure as code programs. Because, Copilot and ChatGPT kind of out of the box and Claude understand how to write code. They don't necessarily completely understand the object models, the schema, how you wire all the cloud services together. And one of the frustrating things for me, still to this day, Pulumi has helped with this problem. But, if you go to a whiteboard and you're explaining to a colleague, well, we want to build this microservice that has a few boxes and lines between these things. I need a database. And then you go to the actual cloud services and you have to configure them. there's a huge impedance mismatch between conceptually what you're trying to do and physically what you need to write in terms of the code. And so the nice thing about our AI assistant is you can go to it and say, hey, give me a microservice in AWS with a Cockroach Labs database and a Cloudflare CDN in front of it. And oh, by the way, I want a Snowflake data warehouse or something. And it will be like, okay, no problem. What language? Python. Okay, here you go. Here's all the code to spin that up. So that was the first incarnation. And then Copilot evolved from there into something that can help with more general management tasks like, hey, what versions of Kubernetes am I even running in my cloud account? And I can give you the list. And in terms of where it's going, a lot more capabilities like that. But, agentic AI where, imagine these smart DevOps assistants that are just getting stuff done on your behalf. And you can program them with prompts like, hey, you're Cindy, you're a DevOps cost optimization expert. Be on the continuous lookout for cost savings and report back to me kind of thing.
Nice. Well, that's awesome. While you were speaking, something came to me. I'm a very visual person, Is it possible with your Copilot that I, as an architect, design the architecture, like an image, a whiteboard, take the photo and put it on the Copilot's head, give me code for this particular architecture? Because I'm a visual guy, right? So does the Copilot do that right now, or do you think that's like a feature you can build in the future?
So it kind of sort of works already, but that's definitely a scenario that keeps coming up that we are going to make sure works great. The opposite does work as well, which is Pulumi can give you the visual representation of your existing infrastructure, including all the dependencies. So it sort of understands the dependencies already. But going the other direction is definitely, we're excited about that.
Yeah, I feel like many times that's what developers like. I mean, I spend a lot of my time architecting. And so I'm like, okay, if I'm using, say, the Bedrock service, and Bedrock service needs to work with, another service like a vector DB or a knowledge base, I want all of this configured. And you have to go through 4 or 5 workflows in just the Bedrock service to enable that. And so if I can just say, hey, this is how I want all of this connected, let's just start it. So you have an EC2 instance, you have the database start, you have the service open, and then you have the S3 when I'm putting some logs and stuff like that. That'll be so helpful for me, But I haven't tried the product, so I'm pretty sure you guys have already thought through this. So yeah.
Yeah, and again, because that's simple, right? It's something you understand, you can communicate. It's still the case that the infrastructure building blocks are, it's kind of by design. They're very powerful, low-level building blocks, but sometimes you want to think of that higher level of abstraction.
One of the things I'm curious about is, like, obviously when you start a company and, you've 2017 is when you started Pulumi, if I'm not wrong.
That's right.
And you've been running the company now. Just want to get your perspective on what were some of the biggest challenges that you have seen as someone who's leading the company, who understands the space that you saw, and that some of the learnings from that.
Yeah, I think it's kind of funny to look back, because I would say we're coming up on 8 years. I said in March, and every year was kind of different, right? Like the first year, we literally locked ourselves in my basement, me and my co-founder, and just like we're jamming on code like all day, every day. And then we had the product, and we actually had a first paying customer before we actually launched anything. But then over time, some of the challenges shifted from building the product to finding product market fit, make sure we listen to customers and solve their most pressing problems. Then the next phase was, okay, graduating more into an enterprise product that can command 6-figure, price tag, in large scale deployments. And like, how do we provide enough value to justify enterprises really standardizing on Pulumi across the entire organization? And then, more recently we went multi-product. And so when is the right time to go multi-product is kind of always difficult. You don't want to dilute your focus, and yet we have big dreams and aspirations. And so we moved into secrets management and asset, inventory and compliance. And I think the general thing across the board has been, growing a company, growing a business, but doing it efficiently. Because I think, economics matter. We always build for the long term. We're trying to build a company that can stand the test of time, so that our customers can bet big on us and believe that we're going to be around in, 15, 20 years. And meanwhile, you're building a team, you're building a culture. And so it's, I think the biggest takeaway is like, there's a lot of stuff to balance. And it's easy to think it's either or, like either it's open source or it's enterprise. Well, no, the answer is it's and. You need to think about both. You need to balance both. And that has been a consistent theme. I think it's an appealing answer that like, oh, it must be one or the other. But in most cases, what I've found is actually a balancing act of many different competing factors.
Yeah, I think the job of a founder slash CEO in many ways is like wearing these multiple hats sometimes, especially in the early years until you build a team around. And that's what I've kind of gotten from many people I've spoken to personally. Did you always had this in somewhere deep inside that I will start a company and run it at some point in your mind, or was this something that naturally came to you like, oh, okay, maybe I'm starting a company now?
Yeah, I would say I was sort of obsessed with the idea that I would eventually start a company. I started that consulting business when I was in high school, and it was fun because, I found my clients. I did a little bit of sales and marketing. I did all the coding, did the support. And then, I ended up almost starting a company with a friend of mine before going to Microsoft, but burned through a bunch of my savings very quickly and realized I'm probably not ready to start a company. And so at Microsoft, I asked myself almost every year, and I kept reading business books. And honestly, I read SEC filings and boring stuff like that, but it kept it fresh in my mind. But, I was always learning something new. I was always having fun. I was always meeting amazing people at Microsoft. And so it never felt like it was the right time. And then my co-founder and I were talking, and we're like, hey, now it's a good time for both of us. So let's make the leap.
Awesome. That's amazing. I love stories like that, and especially when you have, you need so much belief when you're starting something, and you gotta go in and do that. And it's definitely feels like you, somewhere deep inside you had that. So pivoting from that, like obviously now you've run the company for 8 years, you have so many customers you're talking to, but there are still so many people in the industry who are like still sitting on and trying to configure everything on their own. And there is this, where do you think companies are right now in terms of, is it a cultural adoption problem? Do you think it's just the how should we move, or do you think there are other challenges that are inhibiting people from moving and towards this more efficient way of setting up infrastructure?
Yeah, I do think the world is not in a perfect place. There's still, we have to solve a bunch of hard problems still, but I think, the foundation is there. And I think I hear more often now than I ever did before, people say, well, everybody knows infrastructure as code is table stakes. When you're going to go to the cloud, step one is pick an IaC solution. And so I think people are kind of there. The problem that I see is, I mentioned I met with all these folks at reInvent, and it was sort of deja vu over and over. But there's so much undifferentiated heavy lifting. Like, don't get me wrong. It's amazing that people are being successful with Pulumi and, Terraform and other tools that are out there. But they have to go through and discover the same best practices and go down the same undifferentiated path that a lot of their peers are going through simultaneously in other companies. And we think we can make that a lot simpler. So we're moving our focus more kind of up to those more architectural system-wide sort of challenges. I think we've got the tools, we've got the building blocks, and now we need to assemble kind of end-to-end solutions so you can get a platform up and running in a day rather than a year.
Yeah. So because you have such an interesting product, obviously the product is used by developers, but the decision to make things change in the company is obviously at an architect level, sometimes at a senior level. So who have you seen you've had most traction with, communicating with, who understand the message, who feel like, oh, we need to start using Pulumi? So is it a CTO, CIO level? Where have you seen success? Yeah.
And so usually the outcomes that Pulumi facilitate are usually very interesting to the CTO, the head of infrastructure, the CISO, CIO kind of level. I would say most of the time, though, the change is actually being driven by a senior architect who's been anointed by, that team, that executive team, because they trust that person to make the right decisions. So usually a very senior person driving change. And oftentimes we build up a groundswell of support within the team before we even go and, tell the CTO, hey, we've solved these problems to your satisfaction. I would say though, like if it's a startup or a smaller company, a lot of times it will be the CTO who's, picking up Pulumi and running with it.
So in your last 8 years of doing this, working with customer, what is one of the funniest things that you've heard from somebody when it came to your product like that? And that like you were like, oh, I'm surprised, with that. So was there any incident like that?
I don't know if this counts because they were doing something funny before they moved to Pulumi, but
okay,
I literally
let's talk about that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll think about the other one too, but this is not a joke. It sounds like a joke, but we literally worked with a team who managed all of their infrastructure assets in an Excel spreadsheet. And they had written macros to spit out HCL based on the rows in the spreadsheet. So if you wanted to spin up a new like EC2 instance, you'd go to the spreadsheet, append a row, click a button that would spit out some HCL, and there's some like automation to deploy it. And if you wanted to change the size of an EC2 VM, you'd go find the row in the spreadsheet, you'd change it there, you'd hit the button, the macro would run, and spit out some HCL. Of course, they wanted to keep that sort of table-driven view, but with Pulumi, you get a programming language, so you just write an array with a bunch of objects in it, right? So, but it was kind of a funny thing, I would say.
I mean, in many ways, when you were saying that, I have so much respect for people who think out of the box and are creative. Like, I mean, you ask a developer to do something, get something done, and like you will get it done. But I agree, that's like a little bit more messy way to manage it. Any incidents where one is like, was there anything funny that people did with your product? And the second thing was, if they did something that was like your product is really good, but they're not culturally ready to accept it and start using it. Like there was like a blocker or something.
Right. Yeah. So the first one, the funny thing that we actually did with our own product in the early days, because it's just programming languages, we're sort of excited that it's, turtles all the way down. So we actually deployed an AWS Lambda that internally turned around and ran some Pulumi code to deploy more Lambdas. And then we deployed the first Lambda and realized, it started deploying Lambdas faster than we could kill the thing. And it just was like self-replicating. And at some point it started, actually consuming money. And we had to delete the entire AWS account just to stop the thing from self-replicating, which was kind of hilarious.
Wow. Wow, talk about that. That's crazy. And, which year was it? Like early days?
That was probably before we even launched. That was like 2017. So we had like no money, and I was like, oh my God, this thing's going to cost us $1 million. But thankfully, Lambdas are pretty cheap. So
yeah, I agree. Lambdas, it's still affordable. Wait till somebody starts like instances with like 128 gigs of RAM and like 64 core instances, and let it run for 3 hours. I know an incident where that happened. So
it was funny. One thing I tried asking our Copilot was provision the most expensive infrastructure you can imagine.
Yeah.
And it refused to do so. It said, I'm sorry, that violates my ethical boundaries. So it refused to do it.
That's crazy. I was wondering if there would be like some sort of a rule set up in your IAM where you're like, you can't provision more than this much amount of infrastructure. Now, that's a good question. Like I want to ask, like when we have to set up infrastructure, we always have like dev teams, and dev teams that will have like a dev account, and you will segregate IAM based on that. How does Pulumi handle roles and responsibilities and like setting up these caps and kind of making sure that this is working with the cloud provider? Like throw errors, hey, you have reached your limit and you can't put more resources and stuff like that.
Yeah, so AWS has a lot of limits. All the cloud providers have a lot of limits kind of built in at the account level to prevent some of the situations like I just mentioned. You can request that they get increased, but in general, we work with the IAM models of the cloud providers, but we do have our own RBAC system on top of it, because sometimes you want to say, hey, developers have access to these development environments, but not production or staging kind of thing. But we do have a policy as code engine, which allows you to do things like enforce limits. And we actually have a customer who they basically block anything unless it's been approved that would increase spend by more than 10% in a single deployment, for example. So the policy engine is pretty pretty feature rich.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, it's been great to hear from you all the amazing things that you guys are working on, Joe. So, where is Pulumi going next? Like for all our listeners, I mean, I'm going to ask everyone listening in to go check out Pulumi, try Pulumi, and follow Joe and all the things that his company is doing. But tell the people a little bit about what's next for Pulumi, what is exciting for everyone to kind of go and kind of read about it, check about, and also can you like point to some references around how people can get started with Pulumi?
Absolutely. So everything I'm talking about, Pulumi.com is your one-stop shop. Go there, click the big blue button, get started. It is open source, so it's easy to get up and running. It's free to get up and running. So that's where I would go. The documentation is all there. A lot of getting started tutorials. And so I would say the three, a few main areas of focus. One is infrastructure as code. That's still everything to us. It's a foundation for everything we do. We're really excited about the open source community continuing to grow. And we have some new capabilities coming online around our component model to make it easier to share and reuse best practices. These out of the box platform scenarios. So if you want to write a component in Go and then expose a very simple YAML interface to the rest of your team, you can do that today. It's going to get even easier in the coming weeks and months. So that's one scenario. Multi-project deployments. We got a few irons in the fire there, where a lot of times teams break up their infrastructure to minimize blast radius, which is good, best practice, right? I've got my network over here, my Kubernetes cluster over here, data warehouse, applications. But orchestrating large-scale rollouts across all of those environments is still kind of tedious, regardless of which IaC tool you pick. But we think we can do better. So that's an area of focus for us. I'd say Pulumi IaC is our new secrets manager product. So we've got a lot of great work there to make secrets even easier to use. Pulumi Insights, pretty excited about that. Actually, everybody I talk to is excited, where you basically just point us at your cloud accounts and we slurp up everything we can find, do an x-ray of your infrastructure, say, hey, here's what you got. You can search it. You can right click, port it over to IaC, find policy violations, start taming the chaos. Because we know, even though people love IaC, they still have a lot of cloud resources that aren't under IaC management yet. So this will help you kind of get there. So that's another main area of focus. And then I mentioned agents, a lot of AI stuff in there as well.
Yeah. I mean, if you don't say AI and AI agents as a CEO, I would be like, hey, there's something wrong, but I'm glad you brought it up. One of the things that you said, and I feel it's critical, is like a lot of folks who run infrastructure sometimes lack the ability, because we are doing so many things, on where we are making mistakes. And the product that you mentioned, like especially Insights, is super valuable, because if I can get a one snapshot view of where my infrastructure is, how it's getting utilized, whose policies are not accurately set up, that's like a pain point that I hear all the time. It's also my own personal pain point, because we are pushing things quickly and there will be some mess here and there. So an oversight is something really valuable. So glad you guys are adding that to your portfolio.
Yeah, and you get the nice visualizations too. So you start to get sort of an understanding of the chaos and the ability to start taming it.
Yeah. Who's one of your biggest customers right now? Or even if you don't want to say that, what's like the biggest deployment in Pulumi that you know of? That's like, tell the people a little bit of the scale, so folks know how people are using it.
Yeah, for sure. So, our biggest customer, unfortunately, I can't disclose, but they're a Fortune 10 customer, big customer, thousands of end users. They build internal components and share them for best practices across multiple clouds. So that's the biggest deployment that we're aware of. We have a lot of open source usage too. So there could be somebody out there bigger than that. Snowflake uses Pulumi a lot to provision basically their data cloud infrastructure. We're also happy Snowflake customers, and so that's a great partnership. NVIDIA manages like GPU clusters that would blow your mind in terms of the scale using Pulumi as well. BMW, their entire software factory, which is how they engineer the software for their cars themselves and how they develop the cars, is actually powered by Pulumi, and that's been multiple years in the making. So that's been amazing partnership. So a lot of really great, at scale deployments.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, so I mean, you're listening to Joe here, folks. I mean, as you can see, Snowflake, BMW. I mean, Cockroach Labs. We're all in this infrastructure space, trying to do the best for our end users and customers. In Joe's case, it's the developers who are setting up the infrastructure and the companies who want to manage this massive infrastructure, which in the future is going to be scaling like massively, and there has to be a way to for everything to come together. And as a company, it seems like you're focused on making sure that that is amazing for everyone, and you're kind of democratizing all of that for the engineer. So I'm really, really excited for you, Joe. And one last question I had. This is out of just my pure comical curiosity. If you could go back in time and reimagine the cloud infrastructure that we are all trying to solve in our own ways with today, what would you change? I mean, this is like a wide perspective, but I'm just curious to see if you could go back in time and like, hey, I'm going to make some decisions here and change things. What would that be?
Oh, it's a great question. I love the question. I'm going to say something that might make me sound like a crazy person, but sometimes I like to think of the cloud as the new operating system, right? Like we've got Windows, we've got Linux, we've got Mac, but operating systems, what do they have? They have, object models and object lifetimes, got resource management, resource models, and, sort of Kubernetes has taken over some elements of that for the cloud. You have application models and how you configure them and update them and install things. And if you were to kind of reimagine the cloud landscape from the lens of it's actually a distributed operating system, I think we would make some decisions differently. You would approach things with different principles in mind. And I think it would be a little bit less chaotic in terms of trying to tame all of it. Like we're coming along after the fact with Pulumi and trying to retrofit kind of an object model and some sane notion of lifetime. But imagine you could just build the whole thing as a distributed operating system from day one. It would be fascinating. There's some downsides to that. You might think about it too monolithic. Like in some sense, I like the model of let chaos reign and then reign chaos in. Like, and that's kind of where we're at with the cloud. But I think it would be a really fascinating exercise.
Yeah, I agree. I think you brought a lot of wisdom and your own experience into that response, because as someone who's worked with programming languages, that's how you look at trying to solve problems here. Like you kind of go really at the foundation of how we want things to work, and then you kind of go from there. So that's a great response. I don't think it was pretty wild, actually. It was pretty good.
All right.
So hopefully at some point we get a time machine and we can go back and kind of fix that.
It might not be too late. Who knows?
Yeah, it might not be, actually. That's true. Well, it's awesome, Joe. Once again, I appreciate you coming on and taking the time to talk to me and to all the listeners. Go follow Joe Duffy here at Pulumi, and follow the company on LinkedIn and follow everything that they're doing. Really excited to have you once again, Joe. And we look forward to having you once again, where you have some really cool new AI agents working to kind of replicate some of the cool stuff. So, yeah.
Sounds great. Thank you, David. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Appreciate it.